Just share the screen now.
Share now.
Just share now.
Does that come through? Yeah. And then you can...
Okay, you're sharing your screen. You have the presentation. Go ahead and go on presentation mode.
Okay, so first and foremost, do we have any systems engineers in the room? Help us with some IT. Clearly, we need some. Welcome to Palestra. My name is ColesChief. I'm the head of engineering for our major programs. Just want to welcome you to CSR's headquarters, where we've got David Coles, Chief Engineer of the TFT, presenting today. Just going to give you a quick update on the building. We are not expecting any fire alerts or any fire alarms. If you do hear something, we will be leaving via the main entrance, taking a left. There's a meeting point at the end of the road. There's plenty of TfL people here who can guide you. Toilets, back of the room, through there, and also just outside as well. Everyone online, if you see us running out the door, you may have to assume we're not going to be presenting anymore, but that's the primary sort of update, just so you're aware while you're in our HQ. Matt, do you want to say hello?
Yes. Right, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Matt Gibson. I'm the chair of the INCOSE UK RIG. Firstly, welcome. This is the first RIG event we've held in London this side of COVID. So it's really quite exciting to finally get back into London. So thank you all for coming. It's a good turnout, so it's good. And welcome to our colleagues online. So one of the benefits of COVID is we are now online with our events. So we have people from across the UK, and we're also twinned with INCOSE Transportation Working Group, which is an international organisation, and we have colleagues from the American Public Transport Association that we work with as well. So it's great with, one of the benefits of COVID, we're now an international forum, which is really good news. Very quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the RIG stands for Rail Interest Group. We are just that. We're a forum/counselling service for systems engineers in rail, trying to make a difference. We run these events for people to speak and share their experiences. So fundamentally, if anyone's interested in speaking, please let us know. We're always interested to hear from you. And if anyone wants to join, it's a very simple process. If you Google INCOSE UK RIG, you can join up there. That's all I wanted to say. Welcome and thank you. I'll pass back over to Colby.
Thank you, Matt. So it's a nice bit of symmetry, actually. There was 2 TfL colleagues that were involved in setting up the RIG.
Yes.
I did.
Yes.
Can I ask a favor?
What favor?
Can you when I get
If you could go on mute if you're online, that would be great. That's probably Mike, isn't it? So, but yeah, I was going to say, it was 20 years ago that 2 TfL colleagues, Dipesh and I, set up the RIG. And I was going to say also Derek Price, I'm not sure if he's online today, who was really instrumental in that. So it's really nice to be able to hold the first event since COVID in London, because obviously it's the best city in the world. So what we are going to do is hear from David Coles, who is the DFT Chief Engineer. David is responsible for ensuring the department's infrastructure projects are delivered effectively and efficiently. He leads the infrastructure efficiency and engineering team, and he works closely with TfL and Highways England, HS2, and Network Rail to deliver Project Speed, which is about faster, better, and greener. I've also been told David worked for Amy on the infrastructure side and helped set up their first systems engineering sort of early processes as well, which I understand haven't been able to be improved. I know Matt's having a good go.
Yeah, I can't find anything wrong with them. So
perfect. That's exactly what David wanted to hear. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to David, which I think will be a really great presentation and probably some food for thought for us to hear from the policy level in terms of what we think about systems engineering. Over to you, David.
Well, good evening, everyone. Delighted and actually flattered to be invited to do this first post-COVID hybrid event. I'm also, perhaps worth just saying, a civil engineer by background. So I've come sort of relatively late to the systems side of things, although I was exposed to obviously other disciplines in my British Rail days, and subsequently as BR was privatised, I was an area contracts manager. And for the first time, I really had to take an interest in what the guys with the bells and wires did, as well as the guys with the concrete and steel. So it's probably worth taking us back to, I don't know, I welcome shows of hands actually from the audience here in London. I'm sure people wave online perhaps, but has anyone here heard of this? It's Lessons from Transport Sponsorship and Major Projects. Bit of a mouthful, again, a few, good. This was frankly on the back of a few disasters in the Department for Transport projects, Crossrail, Great Western Route Modernisation, where things had gone horribly late and over budget, and the IPA and the DFT got together to look at what needed to be done better. And one of the things they said was that we needed to have a much more professional project delivery organisation, which led to the establishment of the project portfolio delivery directorate, because DFT has roughly £160 billion worth of projects in the pipeline, so not small. It also said that we ought to have an engineering team, a chief engineer. I actually joined DFT 7 years ago into the high-speed rail group to sponsor the railway systems. So, again, getting involved with systems and with railways. But we particularly got involved in looking at some of the standards, some of the costs, etc. And quite quickly, the department decided it would actually be nice to have that function centrally available and available to other projects. So we still predominantly work on rail projects, things like Trans-Pennine Upgrade, East-West Rail, etc. But we are also increasingly starting to look at road projects, benchmarking those costs, etc. And actually, it's worth also saying that in my time, it's 3 years or so since I set up my current team. Of course, managing infrastructure carbon, not tailpipe carbon, stuff associated with petrol and diesel, but the carbon associated with building structures. As we all know, steel and concrete generate huge amounts of CO2, and we want to look carefully at how we can reduce that. So I sort of led the kick-off of that within the department. And of course, we also look very heavily to our commercial colleagues to help us with this, because at the end of the day, DFT doesn't do any actual physical works, and we rely very much on architect bodies and the procurement people to actually procure projects. So our strapline is effective and efficient engineering, and by effective, I mean we're just focusing on getting the scope right. What is it we really want to get out of this objective, of this project? What are we trying to deliver for the travelling public before we sort of dive into solution mode and say, right, we need to quadruple this line or whatever. But having decided we are going to do something physically and build some infrastructure, how do we do it as efficiently as possible? So if you like, perhaps the first one is around value management, and the second one around particularly value engineering. Now, a lot of people said to me when we talked about setting up the team, why do we need any engineers in the central DFT organisation? There are thousands, literally thousands, in our arm's length bodies, and of course in organisations like Transport London. And doesn't the engineering sort of sit there? And I think it's fair to, of course, the vast majority of detailed engineering is indeed managed and delivered very successfully within those bodies. But what we found was that I think, as you all know, the ability to influence the success and the cost of a project comes at the start, actually getting the specification right and the scope right and the objectives right. So, this little picture tries to sort of illustrate how our team works alongside the arm's length bodies engineers to, first of all, develop the business case, and of course it's a trade-off between benefits and scope and actual cost of the project, capital cost. Then, of course, you translate into a scope and then requirements and specification, and eventually into a solution and delivery on the ground. So why a systems approach to project delivery? And I just posted up there the sort of bit up that hopefully you saw in the flyer. But we've never faced such challenges with delivering our infrastructure projects. We've got climate change crisis, we've got economic headwinds, we've got shortages of people, and frankly, after COVID and everything else, and all the other challenges government have faced, the kitty is empty, and we've got to try and get more for less in terms of what we're trying to deliver. At the same time, of course, as you will well know, the complexity of our projects has grown enormously. Having said I've sort of got involved in other engineering disciplines when I started in British Rail, it's fair to say that generally, if you wanted to be doing an engineering works at the weekend, the civil engineers did their bit, and then you left it to the signaling engineers at the end to wire up the track circuits or whatever. And of course, because they were tail end Charlie, whenever the project overran them, they got the blame. But you know, these days, the complexity is vastly more, and it's all about integrating those engineering disciplines. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of talk about a systems approach to this sort of thing. Maybe just worth picking up on some lessons from Crossrail. I mentioned that report earlier, and this was actually taken from something the Institution of Civil Engineers did. So it talked about you know, actively managing systems integration, maintaining configuration control, planning for a lengthy testing and commissioning phase. I mean, all this stuff we've read and left, I'm sure, to you guys. But I would also add some things that I've picked up talking to the sponsor team on Crossrail. Just keep it simple, keep it as simple as possible. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So expect some of you know better than me. But an example I was quoted was that all the light fittings in Crossrail, being a modern system, can have sensors that will say when the lamp or the bulb has failed, and can feed back to some sort of control room and tell the controllers right. And so instead of having to send someone around to check whether or not the lights are working, it's all done automatically. The trouble is, you look back and the amount of testing that's needed to ensure that all of that's working at the start, and also then the instructions you have to give to the control room as to what happens when this little alarm goes off. Do you stop Crossrail? Well, of course not. But you know, it just adds a layer upon layer of complexity. And so the technology's there, but it doesn't necessarily mean we should just adopt it ad infinitum. Also, I'm sure you're familiar with this term, minimal viable product. This is becoming a big thing for us, particularly obviously with the cost pressures on projects. But you know, absolutely thinking about what is the bare minimum we need to deliver, and not necessarily just focusing on the end state, but what are the intermediate states we could take. And again, I'm sure many of you will work much more on Crossrail than I have, but you know, I've heard things like, if only we could have started operating Bond Street with one entrance, you know, smaller numbers, but actually know the whole safety configuration system and everything else demanded too, and it just became too difficult. But otherwise, perhaps Bond Street could have opened sooner. And you know, and also the whole business about the number of trains per hour. With hindsight, we should have planned for a much more gradual step up in TPH. Now, you know, I thought I'd start off with sharing, if you like, a classic systems engineering approach. This is HS2's Railway Systems Management Plan, and I just pulled out, you know, a sample of the contents of that. You'll know all about the classic systems engineering approach to this sort of thing. And, you know, brilliant diagrams, ways of conveying the challenges around requirements management and so on. And of course, your classic V diagram. We may come back to that depending on the discussion at the end. But what I then wanted to share with you was, I don't know, again in the room, have any of you heard of this? So it's the Government Office for Science Systems Thinking for Civil Servants. Okay, yeah. Actually, a very, although it's called systems thinking, when you actually start to delve into it, or that's probably worth just sharing what Sir Patrick Allen said, but you know, if we think physical projects can be complicated, you can imagine trying to actually work out some policy in central government when you've got, you know, a myriad of political pressures, demands on the public and so on. So there was a big push to try and actually encourage a systems approach, systems thinking to policy making in government. And this is just, again, a contents page from the toolkit for civil servants. And then again, you know, I think this presentation will be shared, so feel free, please, to dip into this sort of thing later. But you know, you maybe see some of the sort of quite interesting models and tools that are described there, causal loop diagrams, rich pictures, which I'll come on to. So this is an example of a rich picture, trying to actually identify the influences, the stakeholders, the objectives we're trying to achieve and so on. I'm flagging this and almost jumping to the other extreme from the sort of techie systems engineering end of it, because I think as civil servants, we're trying to actually operate across that whole spectrum. So we're looking at very broad policy demands. And forgive my people online in the US, because this is a very UK sort of centric take on this, but hopefully some of this is chiming at least with what happens in the US and other countries. I'd also like to then take you to this. So this is something the Royal Academy of Engineering produced called Safer Complex Systems. Again, show of hands as to who might have come across this. That's interesting because I only found out about this in conversation with Dame Judith Mackett, who I expect some of you will have heard of, wrote the new building regulations on the back of Grenfell, and a very impressive lady. But she said that the Royal Academy have failed spectacularly to actually share this more widely, because there's some really, really interesting stuff in here. Admittedly, it is very much around managing complex systems safely, but I think for us, there's an awful lot in there. So, and when you look at the panel that was pulled together to develop this, some real brain power went into this. And it starts looking at things like the causes of complexity, and then the consequences of complexity. And I think these are the sorts of things that we potentially start to need to get our heads around a bit more than sort of technical requirements and traditional sort of systems approach we take. And this is just one of the figures in the report, which talks about the sort of more traditional design time controls for complex systems. And again, this is obviously more focused at, well, it's a whole broad range of projects and infrastructure, but particularly this, of course, is looking at things like nuclear power stations or oil refineries or complex chemical plants. But, I think you'll recognize a lot of the terminology in there. And it does just a fantastic job, I think, of sort of trying to describe the different approaches we maybe need to take in this space. But I'll then come on to, again, show of hands, who's heard of the Institution of Civil Engineers systems approach to infrastructure? Now that's good to know. So they've actually done quite a good job of advertising that. So actually, I'll jump straight onto the next slide. So this is probably, you'll be familiar with one of the pictorials in there, talking about focusing on think outcomes, not edifices or inputs. Owners must own projects. Use the cycle process, of course. That one I really like. Think shovel-worthy, not shovel-ready. Ed McCann, who helped launch this, former president of the ICE, is fond of reminding everyone that typically in the UK, we rush to start projects and try and get shovels in the ground much more quickly than our sort of counterparts do in Europe, I guess in the States. But we end up finishing the project later. And of course, once the diggers are on site, that's really expensive. What we need to be concentrating on is making sure that the project is really ready to go. We know precisely what we're going to do before we stick shovels in the ground. So shovel-worthy, not shovel-ready. If I can back up. So it started off with just that broader brush approach, how we needed to go about this. And then it talked about putting those principles into practice. This was in the second document produced, which again, I think just tries to illustrate the processes that people need to follow when it comes to trying to apply a systems approach to complex infrastructure projects. But it quite quickly moved on to talking about part 3, which was developing the right kind of leaders for a systems approach to infrastructure delivery. Again, I don't know if people have picked up on this. How many IC members have we got here? A few, yeah. I was fortunate enough to be invited by Mark Hansford, the knowledge director at IC, to join a group that was looking at this. And Mark Wild, of course many of you will know, was in that group. And it was very much taking lessons from Crossrail and other big projects to say, what kind of leaders do we need? And I've got to be careful because it was Chatham House rules in the meetings. But what came out so strongly was that we tend to focus on a sort of big hitting, heavyweight, charismatic project director who's going to push through one of these mega projects. And but typically they will be focused on schedule and budget. No surprise, that's all the politics is around those two things. Less so, dare I say, on the scope and what is it the project's actually trying to achieve. And I think someone described, Crossrail. At one stage, 45,000 people working on Crossrail in total when you include all the supply chain, bigger than the British Army. And same for Mark Thurston, 30,000 plus. They haven't got the bandwidth to get involved in all the sort of technical detail. So what we sort of concluded in this early discussions on this leaders for systems approach was that you really need to have a guiding mind, someone who is absolutely focused on what is the scope of the project, and what is it you're trying to do, and has equal sort of merit, equal weight, and opportunity on the boards of these project delivery organisations to be able to, if you like, fight their corner for what is it we're actually trying to do and to protect the scope. Now, clearly there'll be cost pressures, clearly there'll be tensions, but it's that, that sort of recognition that what makes a very good project director isn't necessarily makes someone who's going to be the engineering guiding mind. Or I draw a parallel actually with how many Star Trek fans have we got here? A few. So I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but you think of Captain Kirk, the flamboyant captain of the ship, and then the voice of reason is either Spock or Scotty, the engineer. They're sort of there, and I've been told that in the Navy, you've got typically a tension between the captain of the ship and the chief engineer, who is there, actually being the voice of reason and practicality in the whole thing. So I think again, there's something else for us to learn, or indeed, stretching the analogies even further. It always amazes me when you see the credits roll in a film, how many hundreds of people are involved in making a film, and a lot of that is, I guess, down to the producer, isn't it, to manage the budget, the schedule, and everything else. But of course, the film would never happen. It would never be a success without the director, who's doing all of the artistic input and the creative part of the film. So, if you like, encouragement to engineers to sort of feel themselves being that directive person, that creative person for the project. And I know actually the ICE is now working very closely with some other institutions on the idea of design champions to take forward these mega projects and to have that focus on more than just the budget and schedule. And I just sort of put up here a few thoughts about what the engineering guiding mind might be. So in sponsor organisations, this is very much DFT territory. Thinking very early on as to what is it you're actually trying to do, and what standards you're going to apply, and so on. And then once it gets into the delivery organisation stage, trying to ensure that you've got best practice. We've got a risk-based application standards. And I think one of the things that I've certainly noticed in British Rail, what was British Rail, the UK National Rail Network, is that as the industry's disaggregated and we've got so many different organisations involved, each of them very conscious of their commercial position, risk profile, etc., and also a significant loss of experience in the industry, because every time one of these organisations reorganises, it's typically voluntary severance offered. The experienced guys, it's a no-brainer because they get a good payoff. So we lose a lot of experience every time we have a reorganisation, and that's resulted in people with less experience, less willing to perhaps take risks, or to just push the boundaries as they might have done in the past. So big challenges there for us, I think, in the new world where, again, people aren't going to join industry for life and they're used to. However, having said all of that, had a recent visit to the Align joint venture working on HS2. Had anyone been there? Yeah, two. Amazing site. I mean, this is where they're, excuse me, starting the south portal of the the chiltered tunnels, sheds there making all the precast concrete segments, and also, so that's going north, going south, they're casting all the segments for the Colne Valley Viaduct. So a really impressive site. But if you look at the car park and when you arrive, that's the site offices. 3 stories high, hundreds of cars. I think it's something like 1,200 people on that site. 900 of those are operatives, but we've got 300 site people. And that's repeated across many of HS2's construction sites. And if I then look at this sort of picture, this is a sort of breakdown of design client. Sorry, you can't see that. But I think can I move that somehow? Trying to remember what that's actually underneath that. There we go. These design clients, client costs, etc. And if you look at some of the projects where all of those things are included, you can take Thames Tideway. I mean, roughly 50% of the cost going on indirect costs. Have we got any Network Rail people yet tonight? I like the expression they use, which is pounds in the ground, because it, graphically to me describes what we're really trying to do, which is actually spend the money on physical assets that we're producing. But typically, Network Rail and indeed these other, so some of these other projects, they maybe don't look so bad, but bear in mind that the design fees are sort of wrapped up in the overall main works costs, etc. there. But we are seeing, that actually roughly doubling the pounds in the ground seems to be typical. I don't know if it's the same in TfL projects. I'm guessing, yeah. And of course, don't get me wrong, there are massive pressures. I know that Network Rail, have a lot of working at night in possessions. Same on the motorways now. A huge amount of effort has to go into setting up protection systems for workers, etc. And of course, on London Underground, it's even more challenging, isn't it, with getting materials in and out of the tunnels and so on. But nevertheless, we are seeing very, very significant overheads on all our projects. And it seems to me that as projects become more complex, the amount of indirect costs, the amount of people overseeing all of this is just going up and up and up. And I'm sure, don't get me wrong, I know full well those people are all very busy, but, how do we actually break away from an increasingly complex environment in which, we just see extra cost, extra time to solve some of these things through. And I did actually hear a really interesting example from a medic, someone who is in charge of the intensive care unit at St Thomas's Hospital. And I was rather flattered because the Royal Academy of Engineering came to me and said, we think the health service should have a chief engineer, not to look at hospital standards or to look at anything technical particularly, but to look at the health service as a system, because they'd done a couple of studies, one at Kettering and one in Cornwall, where they had gone in and really carefully mapped out what actually happened to outpatients as they went through the hospital. And they talked to the staff and said, right, I'm not interested in what your job description says. I want you to tell me what you actually do. And by doing that, by mapping it out, they actually reduced the average discharge time by 2 hours per patient. So you can imagine, multiply that all up, that's really significant. Anyway, on the back of all of that, this head of intensive care said to me, one of the problems the health service faces now, I'm sure you all know this, is that people are getting older, they have multiple things wrong, comorbidities, I think they call it. And what Hugh said to me was that the thing is, if you've got 3 things wrong with you, you don't need 3 times as many consultants to look after you. You need 3 factorial. So it's 3 times 2 times 1, i.e. 6 times, because of all the interactions that go on between them. So for me, the penny dropped really, that it's the complexity almost, it becomes self-fulfilling. And it's so, last slide. Can you help? What can we do to both address this complexity and at the same time, deliver our projects more efficiently? I'll
to questions.
Okay, so I think what we're going to try and do is Matt is going to try and do the easy bit, which is manage the questions online. I think we may want to stop sharing.
We will.
Do
you want to say anything, or should we go straight?
No.
Do you want me to come up here still, perhaps?
Stop sharing, and then I'll do the hard bit, which is spotting a hand if it goes up and getting the answers from the room. So I'll just let while Matt's getting set up with who's asking questions online. Do you have any questions in the room? Andy?
Well, I think it's more of a few observations.
Yeah.
Firstly, there's the statement pounding the ground, you know, immediately, you know, as a systems engineer sort of gets me concerned, because that seems to be, as you said yourself, the focus is to get something done. Now, it strikes me that the cost risk is the physical infrastructure, high speed to Crossrail, all those things, but the complexity of the system resides in other things, particularly obviously train signaling, and as you say, that seems to come later. So in terms of observation of help, and I think you were sort of getting there, is to focus on those complexities that will drive your whole system solution first. So in case of Crossrail, let's bring it home. The complexity was obviously we've got a system of interacting multiple signaling systems. Surely that is the thing you should focus on first before you start digging holes. We don't. Why? Because all the risk money still resides in the infrastructure, because that massively dominates it. But that isn't where the risk resides. So I'll stop there for now. I've got plenty.
Thank you, Andy.
If I may respond, Andy, I mean, I think I'm absolutely right, and I've heard this said about Crossrail. That, well, first of all, you know, and I said at the start, I'm a civil engineer. They tend to put civil engineers in charge of these big projects because that's where most of the money is. You know, clearly all the tunnelling, and of course, you know, we know that the tunnelling and everything was a massive success, all delivered on time and to budget. But all the risk was at the tail end, and yet also they decided, as I understand it, you know, people who are more closely involved, please correct me, but my understanding is that basically, you know, once all the tunnels were done, you know, the basic physical, civil engineering works have been completed. 85% of the cost. Right, we've dealt with 85% of the risk and handed back a load of contingency. It's just like, hang on a minute, no, 95% of the risk is still to come. And actually, the focus should be exactly as you say, Andy, on that tail end. And frankly, and I've also heard this said again through the IC work, that you need to recognise that people that start off these projects aren't necessarily the right people to see them right the way through. You may well need a different kind of leadership, engineering team, etc., for a different kind of project at the end.
Okay, before we go online, on that note on leadership, so you mentioned the analogy to do with a film.
Yeah.
I mean, most people know the director of a film rather than the producer. So why not go one step further and have the engineer actually in charge, accountable, and the project director actually doing what they should be doing, which is counting, being counting and everything else that goes with it. Hopefully there's no project directors in the room. Would we not get to better outcomes?
That's a really interesting one.
Because that's really what we mean, isn't it?
Up to a point, but I acknowledge that, you know, and I find this in sort of personal relationships with partners or, you know, friends that you meet, that engineers just love to dive into problem solving. That's what we probably became an engineer to do. And sometimes we're a bit too, you know, let's find an answer, let's fix the problem type approach. Whereas actually, you know, you need someone who is just saying, hang on a minute, we can't afford that, or actually
we need to break that typecast. Because I know lots of engineers and some in this room that could fulfill that. And I think that's a step we should take. But I'm going to hand over to Matt. Any questions?
Yeah, well, I'm going to jump in actually. If I could ask a question, and then we've got at least one online. But keep jumping, really.
Go for it.
So it's interesting that you again coming back to leadership. We talked about leadership. I wonder what your view was on how the transition of getting people to that leadership. We're not there today. We obviously need to get there. One of the challenges with the scale of these projects is very often the people who are going through them, they maybe take a decade to learn those lessons. How do we accelerate that lessons learning so that we can accelerate the journey to where we have the support at the leadership level?
Yeah, a really good question. And at this moment in time, I honestly think a big challenge for our industry, because I think, again, it may be a rubbish analogy, but I'm sort of drawn to the, in perhaps 30, 40 years ago, most project directors, project managers were probably older people, dare I say white male, so fairly stereotyped, who'd, sort of been out on site, got scars to show for projects that had gone wrong in the past, and they learned their trade in that way. As projects have got more and more complex, and just the sheer number of projects we do has increased enormously, I think the project management profession have recognised that we simply haven't got enough of those sort of hardened types to do this, and therefore have upskilled through the classic sort of project management tools and so on, to try and ensure that people without that experience can still successfully lead projects. So there's a bit for me that says, how do we get that engineering, that systems approach, that the concept sort of skill embedded in people, other than just hoping that you've got someone who's got 20 years experience. And again, I think that INCOSE and the systems engineering family institutions are trying very, very hard to do that, but I suspect that we're still a bit behind the curve when it comes to the project management.
They're not that sophisticated, but it's being recorded, so I shouldn't say too much.
We've got a question online from Luke Sibsey, who sort of wants to understand, where does the various documentation, Luke, apologies, I'm paraphrasing your question, where does the documentation and the thinking that you presented align to standards and so on? Is it in the international standards? Are they considered and incorporated, or are we?
That's a very good question. I honestly don't know the answer. I suspect not very much, if I'm honest. And maybe that's something that INCOSE and others would like to take away, because I get the impression that quite a lot of what I presented and talked about has sort of almost started from scratch, and some very good thinking in there. But perhaps there's a bit of duplication going on, and actually it'd be really good if someone sort of put their arms around all of this and actually trying to bring a bit of coherence to all of this. I'd agree.
The applicability of standards into particularly rail and infrastructure is an interesting, because very often those standards are not necessarily produced for, they come out of other industries. I think that's the point. And how do we apply them in this space? It is a fundamentally different space. How do we apply them? Question in the room.
Yeah, building on Kuldeep's excellent question, I think. So it starts a little bit with accountability and responsibility. And if we take that back, then where is that set up? I think we've got a link then to NEC 3 and 4 and the contracts. And if you look at them, how they're currently worded and how they work, they do recognize integration, they do recognize complexity, I think is in there. But if you look at the roles and any of the solutions to how to deal with this, I think the recommendation is collaboration and joint ventures. So is there something that you think, and maybe DFT should be more active in helping shape the industry in bringing it back into what the contract mechanisms?
That's a really good challenge, and I think you're absolutely right that we tend to sometimes focus too much on the engineering issues, the technical challenges, etc. But the reality is that it's all about, for all the companies involved, it's about the commercial setup. And I think in this country we suffer particularly because the economic tap's been turned on and off so much. The only even moderately large scale companies we now have, the tier ones, only survive by not actually employing staff that physically do the work. So they subcontract everything. So their business model is around management contracting and so on. And there aren't necessarily the opportunities that there are, I think, in Europe, I'm not sure about the States, to actually really invest in the right approaches. I think that you've probably heard of the construction playbook, something the government's put out there to try and actually address some of these challenges. There's also something called the consultancy playbook. I don't know, that seems to be less well known about.
Is that pretty thin document? Is that?
Yeah, it is. But I understand that it was put out by Cabinet, the same team that put out the construction playbook. I understand that it was, or it was aimed primarily, they had in mind, the management consultants and the etc. However, I think the principles in there are things we ought to be embracing for construction and infrastructure, because it says you shouldn't necessarily be awarding on lowest price. I see this time and again now that the drive to sort of commoditize design, which means that it's about the lowest unit rates you can put forward for your team, and then hoping to recover costs, etc., by spending as many hours as you can on it. But even then, you know, if it's a fixed price thing, well, then do it in the minimum hours you possibly can. And that means that, yes, the design itself might be cheaper than someone else's design. But actually, if you look at the impact on the client, the actual construction costs are way up. You need to give designers time and reward, frankly, expertise to deliver simpler or sort of not just simpler, but better solutions, cleverer solutions. And I think, again, I've heard people like Ed McCann say this, that, you know, maybe finally the drive to reduce carbon will actually get us to think more about actually clever design. I mean, he quotes an example, I think, on the Olympics, where I think his company, so he would say this, but Expedition Engineering designed the roof of the velodrome. He didn't say who designed the roof of the aquadome, but basically the same footprint, same gross floor area. The velodrome had 150 tons of steel in its roof. The aquadome had 3,000 tons of steel in its roof. So just showing how, you know, with some clever engineering, you can actually get a whole different approach. Does that sort of answer your question a bit?
A bit.
Yeah.
I think it does. I mean, you could look at how we work. So what you're talking about, I was thinking about whole life cycle cost and the parametric side of trying to cost things, and that's usually trying to establish a model. Well, if you've got a cost model, and we would like to do model-based system engineering, well, that looks like an obvious link then that we should try and close that gap and collaborate. Which I'm not sure when we.
I mean, I think, you know, the crazy thing, isn't it, is that this industry, construction industry, operates on generally tiny margins, and yet we complain about a lack of research investment in R&D and people and so on. I think most other sectors wouldn't dream of you know, just expecting 2-3% profit on their schemes. I know there's, you know, sometimes there's quite a lot of cash involved in that, but again, moving it away from a high volume, low productivity, low profit type approach to something that's much more sophisticated and uses less people and so on. That's surely, but better people, has surely got to be the way forward.
I think we've got some more questions online.
Do. I'm going to ask his people online, there's some fairly lengthy questions. If they want to come off mute and ask them themselves. Rich Sinnott, I don't know if you want to.
Hi, yeah. I suppose it's an observation with a very general question. So I do a lot of work trying to improve design processes in my company, and the problem being, I've done it many times, and you can optimize one party's part of that process, but you can see the kind of value is actually in the interfaces. What the constraints are, and I think we've touched on it, it's those commercial mechanisms and the kind of archaic mindsets that mean that kind of social aspect, the technical aspect's easy to solve, the social aspect or the soft part is just too much of a hurdle. And I do see things like the construction playbook and talks and people extolling the virtue of collaboration, but it never seems to trickle down. And so at the bottom, those kinds of constraints are still holding back the kind of the capabilities and the kind of the desire to in your own words, uncommoditize design. So if the construction playbook's not going to do it and industry reports aren't going to do it, how do we get beyond that constraint?
A very good question, and I think, to be fair to HS2, and I'm sure other, bodies, and I imagine TfL as well, they're recognising. I think the issue is that to date we've tended to focus on the tier ones. So we've had the collaborative workshops, we've had all of the love-ins about that sort of thing with them. But how do they treat the tier twos and the tier threes? Because that's where most of the work's being done. That's where the real difference could be made. And actually, I think DFTs are think bodies, and then we've got to encourage more of governments, client organisations to actually think about how they get to the tier twos and tier threes, how they engage with them, and actually get the message in both directions that we need to make it.
I agree. I think that's got to be part of the ECI. I think T5 also led in that approach as well. But yeah, no, great question.
So Simon Reynolds, do you want to ask your question? Yeah, comment.
Hi, I don't think it was so much of a question, to be honest. It's more of a comment. But the Colby, I know, raised a potentially slightly tongue-in-cheek comment that if the engineer is in charge, potentially things might go a bit better. I know it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is that outside of construction, actually, there are quite a few industries that do it that way, and potentially, when you look at those, quite a lot of them are more successful in their delivery of projects. So there is a possibility to learn from that, I think.
I think so. It's a really good point. And it was mentioned at the start that I used to work for Amy. And when I worked for Amy, they were owned by Ferrovial. And it was so noticeable that in Europe, most big engineering construction companies are run by engineers. They're not run by commercial people. Dare I say, there is still this legacy in this country of engineers that aren't the right people to run organisations, but most of the rest of the world doesn't think like that. So the challenge, I guess, for all of us to try and address that.
I'm not sure that's restricted to this country, by the way. I think it's. I mean, that is the case in construction, but it's not the case in some of the manufacturing industries in this country.
Is that perhaps because of the particularly disaggregated nature of construction in the UK, that it just reinforces that almost divide?
I don't know. I think there's possibly some element of tradition that's come about here, and it's not something that's potentially been challenged. I don't think there's necessarily. I mean, I'm not aware of any particular conscious thought of it being designed that way.
I think I just want to build on that. I think, in a way, as you mentioned previously, I think a lot of construction in the UK, especially in transport, they do look for that person who's worked their way up the school of hard knocks in construction. And I think we're all accepting by what we're hearing today that the thinking now to lead those mega programs has got to be far more sophisticated. And I think that's a word we will hear more and more in the years to come. And that sophisticated leadership takes an intellect which understands the system. And I think the engineering has to step into that space. That's where I'm at. But I would say that. So, but Simon agrees with me, so at least that's okay. But do you want to keep going?
We'll keep going. Conscious of time, we'll get through as many as we can. Stephen Hughes, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, sorry, I'm just trying to sort out the video. Yeah, I was actually just wondering whether in the project lifecycle we need to have different V models for civil works and for other things like E&M and signalling. And it's really because with the civil engineering works, you spend more time on the design and the installation and the construction than you do on testing and integration. And actually, but if you look at things like signaling systems, the time is probably spent equally in terms of the design and in the testing. But if you look at all the project models that we use at the moment, it's all one big V life cycle. And actually, do we need to break that down smaller to give better recognition of the fact that there are these two different approaches between some of the disciplines and others?
I think Stephen, a very good point. I, maybe look to far more experienced people than me in the audience to sort of comment on that.
Yes, the V model is effectively a waterfall, which is again a steel and concrete construction, which doesn't really fit in with the complexity that ColesChief and others have been alluding to, and the speaker just now. So for modern complex systems, the V model is really very inappropriate. And in order to bridge that gap, not for everything, yes, we still have steel and concrete infrastructure, where we said before, a lot of cost goes, but for the complexity of understanding what needs to happen, the model doesn't work very well. Let me give you an example. For example, we talk about requirements, and one of your early slides showed the classic waterfall model to requirements. Now, coming back to the point made earlier about contracting, well, we tend to like to contract with doors, legalese, detail that we think, or people think, is going to precisely, I think that was a term that used earlier, precisely deliver the outcome. That won't work. It won't work for anything of sizable complexity. And instead of talking about requirements, we need to talk about the needs. What are the needs? Requirements can be derived once you understand what the thing needs to do. And you don't necessarily get there by following a waterfall model. So the whole way we think about complex systems isn't really for our V model, not for many of the systems we have. Not all, some it works well, but for many it doesn't work well. And modern transport systems, it doesn't fit very well in my view.
Very interesting. I'm tempted to go straight back to HS2 and challenge them on whether they've got still that big, because that wasn't a draft I put up, but whether they've actually addressed that, because I think you raised some very good points there.
Could I probably build a little bit? Let's see if you agree on this. So this is probably a question for the room, see if somebody want to say something. So in my world, standards have moved over the last 30
you work for, so it gives us a
So WSP,
okay.
yeah, used to work at TfL way back.
Okay.
But if you look at standards, they've moved from product standards to moving upwards to management standards. Now, the question then is that done now? Or do we still have a legacy in how standards behave and exist? And in other words, do we have the right support by the standards? And are we using them in the right way? Or is that a problem for us as an industry? If you take one of the big infrastructure managers in the company, they put a moratorium on standards and then said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And then they kind of came back eventually and started working with them again. But are the standards useful for us at the different levels?
Yes,
so we
standards?
Well, probably railway group standards, infrastructure managers, their own standards, potentially.
I mean, I've got a comment on that, and then we can go to the questions. I mean, I think I don't want to comment on Network Rail's group standards.
Of course not.
Wrong of me to do that, but I think generically, look, I think we need to look at standards in terms of why they were created, in terms to keep the system safe, standardization, as it were, keep costs down. I just don't think standards are keeping pace with the complexity of the systems. They are now potentially more of a hindrance than they are a support, as it were, to deliver what we need for the UK. And that's, I'm happy to throw that gauntlet down and say, I think our standards do need to be reviewed, because requirements you can change, reuse, they can be flexible, they can be modeled. And I just don't think we've got the intellect or the bandwidth to keep standards to date every year. They're just too big and complex. And they're also interconnected. And those interconnections between the standards are not on purpose. They are by accident. So I think there is something serious that we need to look at for the future. And that's going to be a pretty big job for TfR as well as Network Rail, I think. That's just my personal view.
I'd echo that. I think particularly if you look in detail at standards, you start to find that they constrain each other and they contradict each other. So and that is in part demonstrating the point you just made.
Okay, let's get through these questions.
Let's get through. Conscious of time, how long have we got, Colin, before we get
We've got another 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay, so we may not get through all the questions, but we'll. Jonathan, if you want to
stay a bit late, we don't
ask
often
yours.
get, chief engineer from DMT.
Jonathan.
My one's a short one, if you can hear me, David, but I just wanted to know what your experience was on projects like HS2 in systems engineering on environment and sustainability. And I know there's been a lot on this from the IET, for example, even in Network Rail, who I work for. It doesn't really seem to manifest in standards very much. We've got specialists, but when we're writing our contracts, there isn't really much on environment and sustainability. So I just wanted to know what your experience on HS2, for example, was in terms of systems engineering on that.
Sure. I know that it is very challenging on HS2. And perhaps the example I'd quote is there's a colony of bats near Aylesbury that needed protecting, and the original sort of proposal in the hybrid bill was to put some sort of fencing so they wouldn't necessarily fly into the trains. It's ended up with a concrete artificial tunnel structure, £80 million needed to address that, because there was so much uncertainty over how to actually deal with these things. So, yeah, understanding the standards of that is quite tricky. I'm going to have to sit down.
Oh, sure. Brilliant. So we've got two more, and I've said that's the cut-off. So, Srini, would you like to ask your question?
Yep. Hello, everyone. Just curious to hear your experience or perspective on how well the design visualization or modeling tools like BIM have helped in achieving a successful delivery of these complex projects and HS2 in specific.
Okay, I would say that we've got some wonderful concepts and ideas on in theory on all of this. My experience is that it still needs a client organisation to really grasp these sorts of things. So, talking to the chief engineer on Hinkley, she, had to put a lot of resource herself into actually getting that to work. I think just expecting this sort of collaboration to happen on sort of digital design and so on, at this moment in time is still a bit wishful thinking.
Thank you. Last one, Mike, is that your question? Are you logged on as Tech Ops, or is that somebody else?
No, that's Dale Brown. That should be Tech Ops. Dale, you there?
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right in the room? Yeah, so this will be real quick. It's a big topic, but one thing that we've observed is this thing called accountability fade on these large projects where you got people coming on and off projects at a much faster clip than the actual project duration, which could be, 10 or 12 years. And you're trying to deliver an asset that's going to, last for hopefully hundreds of years, maybe. One way that we're tackling this, and this is sort of related to human behavior and reward structures, how people are rewarded for the job they do to get them to behave, appropriately, is to look at a more intentional systems thinking design of the project organization, so that you don't build in conflicts of interest between the project manager and the lead technical person. And, safety is usually always safe. It's pretty protected. But part of the accountability fade phenomena that we've observed, at least in North American projects, is a very big lack of quality assurance and quality management. It's all assumed to be there. We went through the first quality revolution, in the 70s, 80s, and it started to fade in the 90s. So it's all kind of tied together. And it's a little bit related also to the earlier conversations with respect to, where the risk is, because of the civil contractor, where the big money, the big aspect of the money piece of the pie is relatively, it's delivered, but then, somebody has to come along and put in all the subsystems and make it all work. So there's an aspect of accountability fade, because if all the infrastructure is great, until other folks start getting involved. And then you realize, oh dear, we have to break out the jackhammers because so it's a bigger discussion, but I just wanted to mention that's something we're looking at. And one of the ways we're trying to combat that accountability fade is through more intentional organizational design and layout. So that's it.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a few closing notes to say, but before I do that, I just want to basically ask everyone to thank David, because I think first and foremost, I know how busy you are. So I'm really proud of the fact that you came to our HQ to give that talk. It's an incredibly important topic to us. It's only going to get more important now, I think. So I'd just like that. The audience online, happy for you to unmute, and everyone in the audience just to. And as Matt knows, our current chair of the RIG, this will probably, I think, apart from the next board meeting, I think this is my last meeting for the INCOSE Rail Interest Group. And actually, I was going to say, it's been brilliant from setting it up from a pub committee meeting in Houston. A couple of colleagues, I think Derek and Dipesh, if they're online, that'd be great. To where we are in our 20th year, the chief engineer from the DFT. In effect, we wanted to move it to the policy level. The conversation is there. I do think that actually the industry has lost its way a little bit. And I think some high-profile failures have proven that we can't take our eye off the ball. But from a personal sort of perspective, I just want to thank not only those people in the RIG from who I've learned so much, and I know there's people from Australia and America on the call today who I've enjoyed meeting when I've been over there, but also there's members of my original systems engineering team here today as well, and I want to thank them because actually they did make a big difference to this organization. So it's a thank you from me, and good luck, Matt, and the rest of the RIG team. And the most important bit you probably want to hear is we will be having a beer just down the road. Come out the building, take a right. It's called the Prince of Wales. So if you can join us, that would be fantastic. If you are online, want to pop into London, we're not that far away. Heard the Elizabeth line can get you there quite quick. So all that to join us too. And on that note, just want to say thank you for attending. Thank you.
Brilliant. On behalf of the RIG, thank you for coming, and thank you, colleague, for everything you've done. It's really appreciated.